how are we doing now?
Much better.
Okay. The final segment of our conference looks to the future, and Susan Eng will offer us her perspective. She is currently Vice President of CARP, which advocates for Canadians middle-aged or older. This year, she was named by the Hill Times, which is required reading on Parliament Hill, as one of the top 100 lobbyists in the nation's capital. But here in Toronto, she's probably best known as the former chair of the Metropolitan Police Services Board. On her watch, the civilian oversight body tackled such issues as police accountability, the use of force, and racism in the ranks. More recently, as co-chair of the Ontario Coalition of Chinese head taxpayers and families, Susan was instrumental in winning a parliamentary apology and redress for 62 years of state-sanctioned racism. Perhaps you could begin, Ms. Eng, by telling us about the Chinese head tax and exclusion, which appears to be linked to the guarantee of racial equality in the Charter. Can you explain that?
Thank you, Carol. Remember that when the federal government instituted a law that said that all immigrants of Chinese descent were obliged to pay a head tax, and then they still came, and then they instituted an exclusion act so they couldn't come at all, despite being willing to pay some 2 years' salary in order to enter the country. Not prepared to acknowledge that that was legislated racism. We didn't have the Bill of Rights then. We didn't have a charter protection at that time. Subsequently, of course, we did bring in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, but that didn't propel the government of the day to turn around and say, well, about that racism back there that we instituted, let's apologize for it and let's provide some redress. And they refused to do so for some 22 years. In fact, during that period of time, a lot of the head taxpayers and their families died, as you do, when time passes. And it wasn't until the election of 2005-06 that there was any direct action on getting redress for Chinese Canadians, Canadians of Chinese descent, for 62 years of legislated racism. Now, what was the role of the Charter in that period of time? Certainly it was extremely important midway through the process, and I see a lot of my friends here in the audience who were instrumental at that time. It wasn't my role at that time, but they brought a charter action against the then federal government to demand redress pursuant to the Charter of Rights and Freedoms and to get redress for government-sanctioned racism. Obviously, it fits under the head, but the courts ruled otherwise. The court actually said that there was no apology necessary, and they lost their action. The specifics and the legalities of that, others here can better describe. However, we failed. Now, that failure came in handy later, but it does answer your question of, is it enough just to have a law? Is it enough to just have a charter? Is it enough that the government itself was responsible for legislated racism? Well, the answer to all of the above is yes and no. That is, if you have a charter, it allows people to actually fight for their rights. If you don't have the charter, they have no head of action, no cause of action to bring to court, raise the issue, and so on. Let me explain why it became important later that the court actually ruled that no apology was legally required. It came to pass that in the 2005-06 election, that the then Liberal government, which was in minority, refused, even at that time, to give any kind of parliamentary apology. They said that if we were to give a parliamentary apology, why then we would take up responsibility and liability for whatever kind of redress and unlimited amounts of compensation or whatever. And so they said, therefore, we will make personal apologies because we feel your pain, but we will not give you a parliamentary apology. And it became a critical fact. It was very interesting because we could then dredge up that legal decision that says, by the way, if you give us an apology, you still will not be liable because the highest court already said so pursuant to a charter challenge, which we lost, right? And yet they were not convinced. And it took the now Prime Minister to, in the course of the election campaign, remember, to make the promise that there would be, in fact, a parliamentary apology, which was more important than a simple personal apology. Then Prime Minister Paul Martin said, oh yes, I feel terribly, I apologize as a Prime Minister. Well, that wasn't good enough because this was an act of government. And so it was important that it be a parliamentary apology. So in that way, both the charter challenge, the fact that there was a charter, gave us the opportunity to raise an issue that seemed to be intractable for 22 years and changes of government.